Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, this week, the Senate unanimously passed my bipartisan legislation to rename the street in front of the Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C., Oswaldo Payá Way. Oswaldo Payá was a dissident and a fighter for freedom in Cuba of unrelenting passion and dedication. He was someone who stood up against the Castro regime. He had incredible courage. He spoke up for human rights. He spoke up for free speech. He spoke up for democracy. And 11 years ago, Oswaldo Payá was murdered by the Cuban Communist government. On July 22, 2012, Payá left his house with 3 other people, including Harold Cepero, to go visit friends. From the start of the journey, their car was followed. On the way, the Cuban security services drove Payá's car off the road, killing both him and Cepero. There has never been any doubt about who was responsible for these murders. And indeed, just this week, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights released its long-awaited report on the case. The determination was clear and conclusive in confirming what we have known all along. Payá had long been a thorn in the side of the Castros and the regime, even from a young age. He was the only person at school who refused to join the communist youth. As a teenager, he publicly opposed the communist crackdown on protesters in Czechoslovakia who were fighting for freedom, and he was punished with 3 years in prison. Payá went on to found the Varela Project, which sought a referendum on Cuba's communist system. Their demands were simple: democratic government, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the economic freedom to start businesses. Payá managed to get 11,000 signatures to support the Varela Project, to petition the regime to hold a referendum, and eventually, over 20,000 people supported the call. But the Cuban regime refused to hold one. Payá's fight for freedom made him a target of the Communist Party in Cuba. They harassed him. They tried to intimidate him. They arrested him numerous times. And ultimately, they murdered him. Payá's friend and the driver of the car said that when he awoke after the crash, he was confronted at the hospital by a regime operative, and the hospital was flooded with uniformed military personnel. Under extreme duress, drugged, and threatened with death by regime officials, he signed a document falsely exonerating the regime. That is how important it was to the communists to immediately try to hide their crimes and avoid accountability. It is imperative that they fail in those tasks. I'm heartened that yesterday the Senate unanimously passed this bipartisan legislation that I led to rename the street in front of the Cuban Embassy here in Washington, D.C., after Payá. I want to thank Senator Durbin, who led this effort with me, along with Senator Rubio, Senator Menendez, Senator Rick Scott, and Senator Cardin, all who joined with me in this bipartisan effort. This week, the Senate spoke in one unanimous voice, and it was a voice speaking out for freedom. I also want to acknowledge the tireless work of Payá's daughter, Rosa Maria, who has fought tenaciously and never wavered in pursuing and advocating her father's legacy. She is an incredible, courageous, powerful leader in her own right. And together we have sat down and discussed ways of advancing the cause of justice in Cuba. We will continue doing so. This is the second time that the Senate has passed this bipartisan legislation. In the previous Congress, the House of Representatives declined to take it up. But I urge our colleagues in the House to take it up and pass it this year. And I have a high level of confidence that the House will do that. We need to make this a law, to put it on Joe Biden's desk, and to rename the street outside of the Cuban Embassy. Now, when we change this street name, we're not merely changing signs. It can be a reminder, indeed a forceful one, that shines a light of truth on the regime. Changing the name of the street means that anyone who wants to write to the Cuban Embassy will have to write Oswaldo Payá's name. Or if you need to go there, you'll have to look up the address and see his name. Members of the Cuban regime who deal with the embassy will have to acknowledge that Payá existed. Their efforts to erase his existence and his legacy failed. Mr. President, I've told this story before, but it's worth retelling because it illustrates just how much of an impact renaming a street in front of an embassy can be. A few years ago, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza, after the famed Nobel Peace Laureate and democracy activist in China who was wrongfully imprisoned in China. After multiple iterations on the Senate floor, my bill ended up passing the Senate, a Democrat Senate with a Democrat majority. My bill passed the Senate unanimously. Unfortunately, the House of Representatives failed to take that bill up as well. It was infuriating. However, at the beginning of the Trump administration in 2017, I was having breakfast with Rex Tillerson, then the new Secretary of State, at his office at Foggy Bottom. We were talking about the challenges facing America, and he had recently just met with his counterpart, the Chinese foreign minister. And Secretary Tillerson said, the foreign minister from China told him that China had 3 critical foreign policies. At which point, Rex shook his head and said, Ted, it was the damnedest thing. One of their top 3 priorities was stopping you from renaming the street in front of their embassy in D.C. That's how concerned, that's how terrified she and his communist were of the world being reminded on a daily basis about Liu Xiaobo. Ultimately, I told Secretary Tillerson the following, which is Liu Xiaobo had passed away at that point, but his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China. China would not let her leave. She had never gone to collect the over $1 million that she was due for her husband winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So I told Secretary Tillerson, you tell the Chinese government, if they release Liu Xia, if they allow her to leave and escape to freedom, I'll stop pushing this particular bill. But if they don't, I will keep pushing it, and we will pass it into law. And you can let them know it's not a bluff because I've already passed it unanimously through the Senate once, and we'll do it again, and this time the House will pass it as well. Within a matter of weeks, Mr. President, the communist government in China released Liu Xia and let her escape. That's how powerful shining a light of truth on a despotic regime can be. Mr. President, renaming the street outside of the Cuban Embassy sends a powerful message to the Cuban people that their struggle for freedom will not go unnoticed or be forgotten, that the world is watching and their heroic efforts are not in vain. Their fight for freedom resonates deeply with people across the globe. By passing this legislation, the United States Senate has made a powerful statement of solidarity with the people of Cuba and a resolute condemnation of the oppressive regime that silenced a brave voice for freedom. The Senate has spoken with one voice, and that voice has demanded Cuba Libre, a free Cuba, an end to the totalitarian and despotic state. I urge our colleagues in the House to take up this bill, to pass this bipartisan legislation swiftly. Let us come together as one, as the United States Congress, and force the communist regime to do what utterly terrifies them, to say Oswaldo Payá's name, to say his name. I yield the floor.